Hey, Mr. Clark, can you hear me?
I can hear you loud and clear, Quinn. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. Today's been a good day. The weather's nice here in Maine, and so yeah, things are going well. Hey, welcome everybody. I want to thank you for joining us. I'm Ken Quinn, Regional Director of the Northeast. Here's my buddy Ken.
It is good to see everybody. It's been a while. I've been on location in Louisiana, and last week I had some other things coming up. So I wanted to thank Aaron and Ron for getting the broadcast done for us last week. I know they did a terrific job. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
And
guys.
as Quinn had mentioned, I'm the regional director for the Southern states. And Quinn is a regional director for the northern states, including Maine, where he resides, and I reside in South Carolina. And we have a lot to talk about. I mean, it has been a very interesting couple of days. And Quinn, why don't you tease that thing you put up there in regarding the United States Supreme Court?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so give me a second here. I create a little agenda to kind of keep us on track today. And we want to say shout out to Ron Hooper. He's on vacation, enjoying his family. Normally he's with us, but he is taking some well-deserved time off.
Well, okay. He's visiting his grandkids, and how can that be anything but special?
Oh, yeah, that's awesome. Okay, so we have got a lot. If you guys let me go, I could be doing this all day long. So here's the agenda. Okay. So we're going to do a little history first, okay? For those of you that are new to U.S. term limits, first of all, we want to thank you for joining us. This is a broadcast we've been doing every Thursday afternoon for the past few months, so thank you for joining. If you're new to our cause, we are trying to propose a term limits amendment for Congress, and there's only two ways to do it. We could have under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, that's the amending provision. It provides one method, whereas how we've gotten all of our amendments proposed is by Congress. So if 2/3 of Congress propose the amendment, then the states can ratify it. The other method is we can have the states propose the amendment. And so we're working on both of these primarily on the state initiative. So we're going to get this done.
I want to talk about before we dive into the topic, because it's germane to the topic that we're going to be talking about today. There's a reason why we as an organization have to use Article 5 in order to impose term limits on Congress. And we get this argument a lot. Why not just put it on the ballot? Why don't you just, I would vote for it. Everybody would vote for it. And we know that's true because the issue itself has an 83 to 85% approval rating, depending on where you go, and straight across party lines. Every single different party member wants term limits on Congress. Everybody understands that this will go a long way to help fix what's broken in Washington. But people, time and time again, ask us, why are you trying to amend the Constitution? Why not just vote on it? Quinn, why don't you fill them in because it is germane into what we're going to be talking about, and it all has to do with the same thing, Supreme Court. Ken?
Yeah, and it's a great question, and it makes sense. The people should be able to vote on this, and that's exactly why we have up here on the agenda. Let me pull that back up. The case is, I'm going to turn off the comments here for a second. The case is U.S. term limits versus Thornton. So let me also share my screen. Well, right now we can skip that. So this case in the 1990s, here's the history, everybody. In the early 1990s, there was a huge push around the country for term limits for Congress, also for term limits at the state legislatures. And what happened was, we're just going to talk about Congress now. 23 states passed laws putting term limits on their own members of Congress. Maine was one. Out of those 23, 21 states, the people did vote for it. They passed that at the ballot box. 2 states, the legislatures passed it. And in Maine, the people voted for it. And what happened was, in 1995, the case against us, it got challenged. And what the Supreme Court ruled back then was the only way the states can put term limits on Congress was through Article 5, the amendment process. And unfortunately, that decision overruled all of those state laws, and that's why we cannot vote on this. The court has already ruled, and so that is why we're working on both initiatives to have it either proposed by Congress. Obviously, the chances of that happening is virtually nil at this point, or by the states. Now, yeah.
I'm sorry, Ken.
Well, I was going to say, as we get closer and closer to triggering this convention, then Congress might wake up and realize, we better do this before the states do it to us.
Well, and that has happened in the past. I don't see it happening in this particular situation simply because Congress would be committing suicide as far as their perception of what they do. And I just don't think, even if we got to 33 states, I just don't see them doing it. If they did do it, it would be okay, let me just go back to the 80s when the BBA folks got to 32 states. And they came this close to getting a balanced budget amendment. And then Congress jumped into action. And lo and behold, we got legislation called Graham-Rudman. And that was supposed to solve all of our balance or budget issues. But it didn't. It had holes big enough to drive the moon through. And so I kind of don't see that happening. But I think it's important to reiterate why we can't vote on this. And that is because the United States Supreme Court, Thornton versus us, U.S. term limits, said that the states do not have the authority to impose limits on their own congressional delegations' terms. I don't agree with it. Justice Thomas didn't agree with it. But that's what they did. So now we're living under that. We have to amend the Constitution, period, right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, what I want to share, and we want to talk about, Ken, there's some interesting, a very interesting ruling this week. Now, we're going to cover a lot of topics today, everybody. And I want to just pull up, I'm going to share my screen here. Let me just take us out of the picture here for a second. So there was the case. U.S. term limits versus Thornton. I got to read that again. I need to go through it with a fine tooth comb and really understand it. Yeah. But this week, in this case, now this was a decision made by the Supreme Court this week, Shafalo versus Washington. And what this dealt with is the Electoral College, and specifically the faithful presidential electors. And now this has nothing to do with changing the Electoral College. There's an effort now to change that, where the states can basically create a compact and vote for the popular winner of the election. We're not talking about that. What this case dealt with is, do the states have the authority under the Constitution to basically penalize the electors in the presidential election who do not vote or cast the ballot according to the will of the vote of the people? So, for instance, in 2016 here in Maine, we're unique. Maine is only one of two states that does not have a winner take all when it comes to the Electoral College vote. And one of the electors in Maine was supposed to vote for Hillary Clinton in that congressional district because she won the most votes. What that elector did was he voted for Bernie Sanders instead. Now, I think most of us all think about, when we go to vote, we're voting for a president, but technically you're not. You're voting for the electors who will then cast that vote for you. And this ruling has basically finally put an end to this idea that electors can decide for themselves who they want to vote for. In every election we hear rogue electors who are going to vote for a different person than the people voted on to try to change the outcome, and it's never gone anywhere. I think out of the thousands, 20,000 electoral college votes cast, I think the only about 180 were ever against the person who was voted for, so it never had any outcome that changed it.
Right. In 2016, there were only two.
Yeah.
There were only two. One thing I did want to point out, though, is in this decision that we do have up there, while it didn't go towards the Electoral College per se. And this is just kind of a sidebar here, so I'm kind of going down a rabbit hole. It doesn't really have much to do with what we're talking about. But as far as the Electoral College goes, it did reinforce the Electoral College and put pretty much all those states that have decided to do that compact into a box, and their only way to get rid of the Electoral College now is to amend the Constitution. So they're pretty much going to be in the same boat we are. Sorry for that sidebar, but anyway, that was a side effect of that decision.
Yeah, so and what's unique about this decision was that it was a unanimous decision.
Yeah.
Unanimous Supreme Court decision stating that in this case, what happened was in the state of Washington, 3 electors voted against the will of the people, and they got penalized $1,000 a pop. Mm-hmm. And the court ruled, yeah, the states have the right to do that, the authority to do that under the Constitution. Now, what's really caught my eye was Justice Thomas in this decision. Now, let me pull up. Go ahead, Ken.
In Thornton versus U.S. Term limits, that was a ruling that I vehemently disagree with. But Justice Thomas wrote a dissenting opinion on that decision, and so I think this is where you were headed in the Shafalo decision that came down on the 6th of this month. Thomas references the Thornton versus U.S. term limits case over and over, and his dissenting opinion. So what's really fascinating is in this unanimous decision that came down on July 6th, everybody agreed, but for a whole host of different reasons, 2 of which, Quinn, I think you're getting ready to point out.
Yeah, what I wanted to share, and when I read this, I saw a glimmer of hope for us. And this is Justice Thomas's remarks. Now, he did concur with the decision, but he basically said, listen, the court was wrong in how it decided it, even though they decided correctly. And this is the quote that I found pretty fascinating. So here's Thomas. Finally, the court's interpretation gives the same term, quote, manner, unquote, different meanings in 2 parallel provisions of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 4 states that, quote, the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, unquote. In U.S. term limits, he's talking about our case back from 1995, in which he dissented. The court concluded that the term manner in Article 1 includes only a grant of authority to issue procedural regulations, not the broad power to set qualifications. Yet, today, the court appears to take the exact opposite view. The court interprets the term manner in Article 2, Section 1 to include the power to impose conditions or qualifications on the appointment of electors. Now, that is fascinating because the first thing I thought of when I saw that is, I wonder if the court is changing its view. Can we go back to have our decision possibly reviewed to allow the states to set the qualifications to determine if they want to limit how many terms their own congressional delegations can serve? So I think there's a door opening here for us again. What do you think, Clark?
Well, I think it's quite possible. What I find interesting is that in Kagan's affirmation of the opinion, she talks about how it's all about the appointment. Okay, when you make the appointment, you're granting all authority. And while that's true in some cases, it's not true in other cases. So what Justice Thomas is arguing is that the term or the manner in which the states have the authority, that's what matters. And I know I'm kind of confusing this a little bit, but one talks about the appointment having precedence. The other talks about the manner of their disciplines. Okay. In both cases, they argue, and especially Clarence Thomas, he argues that under the 10th Amendment, all power that is not specifically enumerated to the federal government resides with the states. And that's why the term manner matters. In Kagan's, the term manner doesn't matter because it's the appointment that makes a difference, and that the federal government still has supreme jurisdiction overall, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's kind of the distinction between the two decisions. Kagan's trying to argue for federal power. Thomas is trying to argue for states' power, and they still arrived at the same decision.
Yeah, so this is going to be really interesting to see what happens, and it was very encouraging to see that. And now, there's so much we can talk about today with this decision.
I know, it's so confusing.
Because one thing we hear all the time when it comes to the Article 5 convention is, well, if you hold a convention, then those delegates, they're technically called commissioners. Those commissioners can do whatever they want, and it can run away. And, this, even though this is not about an Article 5 convention, but this just adds more precedence that delegates, commissioners, electors, they are bound by the state legislatures. Okay. They're bound, legally bound. And I'm going to prove that once and for all those con drones out there who can't understand this simple fact. Now,
and then, by the way, let me just jump on something you just said. You said you used two words: simple fact.
Yeah.
They are facts.
Yeah.
These are not opinions. These are not assumptions. These are facts that have the gravity of law. They have the weight of law behind them. This Shafalo decision reinforces that law. That's a fact. It's not an opinion. Go ahead.
Yeah, and our history is full of examples and precedents of all of this. The rules for conventions, the commissioners being bound legally. And so I'm going to throw a lot out you right now. And if you're just new to what we've been talking about, don't get discouraged. This is exciting stuff. So let me just share some comments. Just some comments. All right. We have a long, rich history of conventions amongst the states. Now, we all know about the Philadelphia Convention, okay? But previously, before that, we've had numerous conventions. This is how the states dealt with problems. In fact, the Philadelphia Convention was recommended back in the Annapolis Convention the previous year. 5 states got together. They didn't have a quorum. So they said, hey, we got to meet in Philadelphia next year to create a new constitution. They had full authority to do that.
That was a recommendation that came out of Annapolis.
Yeah, that was the recommendation.
I like to refer to it Indianapolis.
Yeah, and we'll cover that more in the future. So the conventions of states have been happening. It used to be conventions of colonies before independence. Then it became conventions of states. And we've had numerous after our independence and our Constitution. So now the only difference is we've never technically have had an Article 5 convention. The only difference being the states are meeting to propose an amendment. Okay, everything else is the same. But we have had 2 conventions of states to propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. I'm just going to discuss one here today. So I thought you never had one before. We have. Technically, it's not Article 5 because Article 5 requires 2/3 of the states to apply ahead of time on the same subject matter to force Congress to call it. So a little history here. The year's 1861. The country was divided. We're heading towards a civil war. The states, unfortunately, waited too long to act, but Virginia stepped up and called a convention of the states to propose an amendment to prevent the Civil War from breaking out. Long story short, 21 states sent commissioners down to Washington, D.C. I think a total of 131 commissioners were there on February 4th, 1861. That convention was called to propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Now, I'm going down a rabbit trail. This thought just popped into my head. That's a convention for proposing an amendment. On the very same day, we had another convention of states. We were having an official constitutional convention to adopt a new constitution by the Confederate States in Montgomery, Alabama.
Yeah.
So on the very day, we had two types of conventions convened. One to propose an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, one to adopt a new constitution for a new country. Fascinating history. All right, let's go back to the Washington one. They met for 3 weeks. Now, because it was not called under Article 5, requiring 2/3 of the states to apply, they couldn't send it out to the states for ratification. So what they did was John Tyler, the former president of the United States, was the president of this convention. He delivered the amendment to Congress to have Congress propose it to the states.
What happened?
What happened? Well, I typically throw Congress under the bus here because they sat on it and the war broke out. But Congress was trying to solve the issue as well. They did propose an amendment themselves. It's called the Corwin Amendment. It's one of the six amendments that never got ratified. So at the very same time, Congress was proposing an amendment. Theirs passed. It got sent out to the states. They sat on the one that the convention delivered, and I think only 3 states ratified the one from Congress, and then the war broke out, and we know the rest of history.
Really, very quickly, I had a conversation with a candidate today who's running for office, and I was talking about the Uniform Law Commission, and I was using that as an example of how the states already get together in the form of convention.
Dude, you burst in my bubble here. That's okay. Go ahead.
Well, but what's really interesting is he said, well, okay, but the Uniform Law Commission only has the power to propose legislation.
No
kidding. Wait a second. The Convention of States, for the purposes of proposing amendments, has no more authority than that. All they can do is propose an amendment. So what's the difference?
And that's exactly what Article 5 says.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. So we're going to cover the ULC because this is great stuff. So let me just up on the screen. I want to show you. This is the commission. Now, what controls delegates or commissioners at a convention is the commission issued by the state legislature. This is the commission that the delegates from the state of Maine were given by the state legislature to the 1861 Washington Peace Conference. And what I have highlighted, you can't see it very well. I'm going to read it to you. It says this in the last sentence: said commissioners to be subject at all times under the control of the legislature. Okay, so here it's very explicit, and this is how all commissions work. The delegates, or I'm just going to use the word commissioners, they are agents of the principal, being the state legislature, and they are at all times subject to the control of the legislature. And that's just, I just wanted to show that to you because this plays very well with what the Supreme Court ruled in regard to a faithful presidential elector. They are bound, and that pledge that they take binds them legally. And so it was just nice to see that precedence confirmed even more for us today. Even though we have had tons of these conventions, we know how they work and we know how commissioners are bound. It's good to see the evidence.
Well, and that brings up a very good point, because I had to tackle the argument again today of the runaway and how once they get there, they can do whatever they want. Nothing could be further from the truth. Nothing. And I use the term impossible today. And I use it all the time, because the idea of a runaway convention or a con or what have you is impossible. What we're talking about and what Quinn is trying to explain to you are the reasons why it's impossible, because it is. These commissioners can't go there and do whatever they want. They can't. It's a violation of law. In some cases, they can be fined, like what you saw at the delegates to the 2016 convention did. They violated their oath. They violated their pledge. They were fined $1,000. That's what this whole thing was about. And the reason the court case was brought was to challenge the veracity of that quote unquote pledge. Anyway.
And James Madison makes a great case in Federalist 40. I posted the link in the thread there. Please read it. That's his argument refuting the charge that the delegates to the Federal Convention exceeded their authority. And what he does, he points them back to the commissions. And you can find the state, the commissions that the legislatures appointed the delegates, and you can read the authority that they had. And so that's how he makes the case that they had full authority.
And now, something that I also find interesting, and I know that I keep going down these rabbit holes, is let's say we were at convention and the convention was there to propose a term limits amendment, right? And there was a state, whatever, pick a state, California, Massachusetts. Let's say they decided they wanted something else on the agenda that wasn't in the application, which is the resolution. And so if they gave their delegate a commission that gave them the authority to open up anything, the convention itself would never seat a delegate that didn't have a commission that was in line with a resolution. Why would they do that? They wouldn't. That commission itself would be out of order.
Yep.
So that delegate would never be seated.
Oh, yeah. And so this is a long-standing practice. Now, this is where I want to share. This is really quite fascinating. And it brings us back to the Supreme Court ruling this week. Now, even though the Supreme Court just ruled on this, the states, I think, early in this previous 20th century had been passing their own laws, making their delegates faithful. Okay, so they were doing this on their own already. And back in, let me slow down a little bit. So the states have been doing this. SCOTUS, the Supreme Court, just confirmed it for everybody with this ruling. But when we go back to the history of conventions, as I mentioned, we've had about, I think Rob Nadelson's done a great job of research. He discovered about 40 conventions of the states. In fact, I found one of those, the Missouri Convention. It was in 86. That was a regional convention. I found it. He did the research, got the rules, everything that was, all the notes on it. It's pretty cool. Now, since 1892, there has been an official convention of states held every single year. And let me share, people, you had already mentioned this, except for 1 year, 1945, they did not meet. This began amongst the states because the federal government was interfering with the state's authority. Basically, they were encroaching on the state's enumerated powers. And what the states wanted to do was push the federal government back and say, hey, listen, this falls under the 10th Amendment. So feds, you mind your own business, we'll handle it. Long story short, this began, it was originally called the National Conference of Commissioners on Uniform State Laws. The purpose of it was to have the states propose uniform state laws. So when you travel from one state to another, the laws are uniform. And this is fascinating. When I heard of this, it really piqued my interest. I actually attended one of their conventions. They meet every year for a week. It operates just like an Article 5 convention. Let me share with you how it does. The legislatures appoint the commissioners. Some states, the governor will appoint the commissioners. So it's an official commission. They are given commissions when they go down to the convention every year. Stated in those commissions are what they are allowed to discuss. The scope of their convention is predetermined, so it's a limited subject matter. They can only address the predetermined subjects. And what they do is they meet to draft, debate, and pass what's called model acts or uniform acts. I'll give you an example. Most people have heard of the Uniform Commercial Code. That came from this body. It's one state, one vote, just like an Article 5 convention. It's only a proposal. And what happens, it even mirrors the ratification process. And when I was there, what they do is they break up into committees, then they get together, they vote committee of the whole, and it's fascinating. After an act gets passed, their commissioners then bring it back to their state legislature to find a sponsor to get it adopted as law. Ken?
if a commissioner is appointed and allowed to go to that Uniform Law Commission convention, aren't they required to introduce that legislation?
I don't know.
They don't have
know.
to support it, but I thought they were required to introduce it.
No, I don't think it's a requirement. They just have to go, most often they will go back and try to find a sponsor, because some states might not want it. So,
right, I know that. They don't even have to support it themselves. They just, I thought the deal was that if it came out, then they could go, I mean, they could introduce it and then torpedo it themselves.
Yeah.
But I thought they had to introduce it.
No, they can't, because they're not, most of them are not legislators. So they actually have to find a sponsor. If you go to the uniformlaws.org, you can actually see all of these acts. I think they've passed about 300 now. And every session before, when I travel to a state, if I'm going to testify, I will look up to find out who the commissioners currently are in that state, try to meet with them. I will also take a look at what acts that legislature is currently debating and may adopt, because they are not even aware that what they're voting on has come from a convention of the states.
I know. It's so funny when I see that. Yeah. It just cracks me up.
And basically, all I tell them is like, listen, all you have to do is adopt the rules that the uniform law that you're already using. We know how an Article 5 convention works because you're already sending commissioners to one. Basically, it's the same exact rules. The only difference, instead of uniform laws, you're proposing an amendment that has been agreed to by 2/3 of the states. All right, so here's the tie-in. Let me share the screen again. Sorry guys, I get so. Let me pull this up. Okay, so I'm going to move us out here so I can show this completely. So here is the Uniform Law Commission. What's fascinating about this is the in 2010, this convention. Now, it's really a conference, but a conference, apples, oranges, same thing. In 2010, they already passed the Faithful Presidential Electors Act. So 10 years ago, this body passed this act. I think 6 states had adopted it. So all that we saw this week was the Supreme Court finally catching up to the states. And this was done in a convention. And it just proves that the states are well able to meet, to propose solutions to problems that they are facing. And it's never run away. The process is very well established, and it's safe, and it's something that we use every single year. I just found that pretty cool, how it ties into the ruling this week.
Yeah, I really like that as well. That's amazing, isn't it?
Yeah. And so what's fascinating about this is that they operate just like a commissioner would be at a Article 5 convention. And so this whole idea that we don't know how an Article 5 convention would work, we don't have the rules, we all can just take a deep sigh of relief and realize, oh, we're already doing this every single year.
Yeah.
So for those people out there,
the idea that this thing can do whatever it wants and rewrite the Constitution, I mean, anyone with any schmidgen of common sense realizes that that's a joke. I mean, It is. It's laughable. And those folks that still throw that out as an argument, they don't realize just how silly they sound. I mean, they do. They sound silly.
They sound ignorant. And listen, I used to be ignorant of this. Most of us were ignorant of all of this until we actually just looked at the history. And so you are either in two camps. There is no middle ground with this issue. You are either ignorant of the history and the facts, which is understandable. Most of us were, okay? But once you are presented with the facts and the history, you no longer have an excuse. So it's either ignorance, then you can be enlightened to the truth, or it's motive to deceive.
Right.
And most of the ones that oppose us, they've heard the truth. they've rejected the truth, and their motives are to deceive, to use fear as an opportunity to raise money for their organization or to maintain the status quo and protect the establishment. Those are the only two camps you're in.
And what's really fascinating, I find, is, I talk to a lot of people on this, and I always say the same thing: prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. And nobody can ever do that. Nobody ever accepts that challenge. It's kind of like those that like to claim that U.S. term limits is funded by Soros. I always tell them the same thing. If you can prove it, I'll write you a check for 10 grand right now. Prove it. All you got to do is prove it. Because I can throw anything out there as an accusation. Proving it is something entirely different. And when like you had mentioned, Quinn, we have the facts on our side. We have the proof on our side. We're not afraid of these challenges. We don't hide behind them. We try to educate people so they can get out of the ignorance column and into the activist column. Once they truly understand this and the power of it, they'll get to work and help us.
Oh yeah. And, I want to go back to the decision of the court. And, usually during these segments, I'll get down to my nerdy history hat, right? And I'll throw out quotes from the federal.
You don't want to see that hat, ladies and gentlemen. It's not pretty. It's just not.
Now, the reason I do that, first of all, I want to educate myself. And that's what turned me on to Article 5, was reading the writings of the framers. But what's so important about that is when you read these decisions by the court, in fact, the U.S. term limits and the one I just showed you about the faithful presidential elector, they are going back and they are quoting the Federalist Papers. They are quoting what the framers wrote to one another during this period of time. They are quoting what the debates at the state ratifying conventions between 1787 and 1790, what the people believed the Constitution said. So that's why that little history moment that we do is so important, because the good news in all of this is that the Supreme Court has a very strong record when it comes to Article 5 of being very strict in its interpretation of the original intent. And so the more evidence that we can show that the framers intended Article 5 to be a limited convention, I don't have 10 grand, Clark, but I challenge anybody out there, produce your evidence that the framers intended an Article 5 convention to be anything other than a limited convention. You can't do it. I challenge you.
I'll back it up. I'll back up that statement. You bet. I'll put my money where my mouth is.
They all understood it was limited. They needed 2/3 on the subject matter before it can be called, and that's the only thing that can be addressed. It's equal to Congress. Congress can only propose an amendment if 2/3 of them pass the amendment. It takes 2/3 for both. So anyway, yeah.
You know what we need to do?
What?
We're going to post. In fact, I'm going to do it right now. I'm going to post this decision on the Facebook thread so that, because it's out there, I want everybody to see it. And so I'm going to post it in this thread right now.
Yeah, post both of them. Post the U.S. term limits one from 95 as well.
I'll get that one.
Yeah.
Let's see. Thornton versus U.S. term limits. There you go.
Now, wouldn't it be great if we got this revisited, that the court might take another look at its decision in 95 and say, you know what? We probably should be consistent. If it doesn't specifically prohibit the states and grant the authority to Congress to decide term limits for their own congressional delegations, we should leave it up to the states to decide. Let the people decide. Oh, wouldn't that be a beautiful thing?
That would be awesome. How about the case law, findlaw.com, case law briefs. I got to find it. Oh, there it is, from the Supreme Court. There it is.
Got it?
Oh, no. No.
No.
Yeah, that is the opinion. That's a prevailing opinion, full text option. There we go.
All right. Well, listen, we'll get are there any questions? Anybody else? Okay, so if you thought we should be able to vote on it, now you know why we can't. So what we need you to do, you know what I wanted to show? We have a pledge, and right now We're heading into election season, and we need all of you out there to go to our website, go under the Article 5 section, grab the pledge that we're asking state legislators or candidates for state office to sign, because we need to grow support in your state, in your legislature, to pass this resolution, because we are seeking to call a limited convention for one amendment, term limits for Congress. And Clark, before we jumped on, I think I shared with you, I got a pledge in from a candidate today. Yeah, in Maine. So I sent an email out today. I got, I think, 2 in today. Many of them are more than happy to sign the pledge. We just need we need you folks out there helping us. We can't do this without all of you. So please, if they want your vote, you want them to sign the pledge. That's my stance. You don't sign the pledge, you don't earn my vote, period. I'm
going to put the Wikipedia link on there, Ken,
right,
because it's got both Anthony Kennedy, who wrote the prevailing opinion, and it's also got a link to Clarence Thomas, who wrote the dissent. Okay. So Wikipedia is about the best I can do in short notice. All right.
That's great. That's awesome. I'm going to dive into USTL versus Thornton, I think, over the weekend. I'm taking tomorrow off, and I'm going to jump.
I need to read it again. I haven't read it in a long, long time.
Yeah.
But I find this whole thing with this Supreme Court decision that came out a couple days ago, it just simply reinforces what we've had. And what it kills me is we've had ample proof of this already, Ken. I mean, we've had ample proof. And this just goes to reaffirm the ample proof that we've already had. Right?
Yeah. And I don't want to depend on the court for anything. I don't trust their decisions. I'm tired of hoping and praying at the end of June, some good decisions are going to come from the 5 ring wraiths in their black robes. And it most often doesn't come out the way I would like it to, and we've got to, as a nation, stop depending and putting so much trust in the court. It's up to the states. Here's a little bit of history for everybody. There have been 4 amendments proposed and ratified that overturned U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Okay.
Yeah, the 11th Amendment was the first one.
Yes, the 11th. I forget the numbers off the top of my head, but 4 of them. And so if we're not happy with Congress, if we're not happy with the president, if we're not happy with the court, we can adjust it. We can change. We can overturn rulings by the court. We can rein in the overreach of the federal government. Hey, babe, you're on national broadcast.
Hi, Kelly.
You're in the groceries. What's for supper? And if we want to rein in the president, we can do that. It's our government. We have all of the authority through the amending provision, Article 5. We just got to get our state legislators to wake up and use that authority once. They've never used it. And so it's time to wake up, America.
It is. And what's funny is the states created the federal government, the monster. They created it. They have the authority to fix it, and they just don't have the guts to do it.
Yeah, and you know what? Out of the 12,000 amendments that have been introduced by Congress, never have the states introduced one amendment under Article 5. It's time to step up. Let's make term limits for Congress the first one the states propose, and I see it changing our future. So anyway, I'm done pontificating this afternoon.
All right.
We went a little long here today, long in the tooth, but
that's all right. I mean, when you're talking about Supreme Court decisions, it's not easy to do it in a manner that is easily understood. I mean, I read through this, and I got stuck on the very first paragraph of Thomas's decision because, for whatever reason, I had forgotten that he wrote the dissenting opinion on Thornton versus U.S. term limits, and when I remembered that, it was actually Scott who reminded me of it. And I went, oh, all the lights went off, and I went, oh yeah, that's what, now that paragraph makes perfect sense. Yeah. But I probably stared at it for 10 minutes before that just jogged my memory.
Yeah. And I'm not really all that qualified to pontificate too much on that, but I'm going to learn more. We always got to learn, my brother. Always got to learn.
Yeah, we do. Yeah, we do.
All right, everybody. I think we'll call that a wrap. Thank you for joining us, Clark. It was a pleasure, as always.
Always. That was a fun one. Thanks, Ken.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.